Hello, St. James, and welcome to our very first episode of Coffee with Father Ryan. My name is Jonathan Blevins. I'm the Director of Evangelization here at St. James, and I am so blessed and lucky and just honored to be in the presence of our amazing Associate Pastor, Father Ryan. Father Ryan, how are you doing today?
I am great, and I'm starting to shake a little bit from all the coffee I had.
I was going to say, about how many cups of coffee do you have per day?
Not many, but when I drink it on an empty stomach, it shakes.
I love it. I have about 2 cups a day, sometimes three lately in the quarantine in order to be able to focus.
It's because you have a newborn.
Exactly, exactly. Also, people might notice that it's not Halloween yet, but I am dressing up a little bit like you. Although you have a better
Except you
beard
don't
than
have a
me.
killer beard.
You're killing me. Your
Yeah,
beard is much better than mine right now. I'm very
yeah, it
embarrassed.
is. It is, yeah.
But anyway, thank you
Let's
for being
try.
here. This is great, and let's dive right in. So the format of Coffee with Father Ryan is that we will join each other maybe weekly and talk about a different subject in the church and answer maybe some common questions that people have, and let you spend some time educating us as parishioners, and for those who are joining us outside of our parish, on questions about the sacraments or the church in general, or what we can do during this trying time, or prayer or scripture. And we can kind of see where it goes from there.
Sounds good to me.
I love it. It's a great idea. I'm glad some of us thought of this idea. It wasn't me, but somebody did. So let's jump right in. Our first topic today is going to be spiritual communion. So
Mm.
maybe people have heard a lot about spiritual communion. I certainly have. I've been watching Mass with my family on Sundays, and sometimes there's a little break for us to be able to have that spiritual communion. It's nice to be able to pause. But there's a lot of questions about it. What is spiritual communion, Father Ryan?
What is spiritual communion? Well, I would say it's a recognition, really, at the heart of it, it's a recognition of what the sacrament is and what the sacrament is not. So, spiritual communion is a way of recognizing that a sacrament is a way that we can receive grace, but at the same time, God's grace is not confined merely to the physical aspect of the sacrament. And so, spiritual communion is a way of acknowledging that God's grace can come and meet us, that we can put ourselves within the power of God and God's grace, even in extraordinary times like this, without um, receiving the Eucharist itself, physically, sacramentally.
I love that explanation. Is there a difference between the graces that one can receive in the physical Eucharist versus spiritual communion?
We might say that when you receive it sacramentally, like at church in normal circumstances, you receive the sacramental grace. But really, what a sacrament does is points to a deeper reality. I mean, I know, John, you love the Gospel of John for obvious reasons.
Love it.
And John is all about that. John is all about digging deeper to see not just the sign, but to see the reality that the sign is pointing to. So for communion, the accidents, we say, of bread and wine, the thing that makes it look like bread and wine, even though we know it to be body and blood of Christ by faith, those are signs pointing to a deeper reality, that it is really the body of Christ that nourishes us. And that deeper reality, aside from the sacrament itself, is a grace that we have been called to full communion with God, who is Father, Son, and Spirit. So it's a matter of distinguishing between kind of those aspects of the sacrament, so that we know that even without the sacrament, we can enjoy that grace. The ordinary way to enjoy it is through the sacrament, but in extraordinary times like this, um, that grace is still available.
I love that explanation because you actually answered both questions right away, which is the what is spiritual communion and why we would do it. Because in these extraordinary times when we're stuck in our homes and not able to attend Mass like we normally are, we're the why. Well, that's why we do it during this extraordinary time. So I like that answer. Next
Right.
question is, how does one receive spiritual communion? How does one receive those graces that you're talking about in spiritual communion?
I would say that spiritual communion is a way of opening ourselves up to the power of God, to the grace of God, not as if grace was just some token that we collect and kind of put in a a spiritual bank account or something like that, but as a way of completely dedicating ourselves to the power of God and the mission that we've been entrusted to. So, in terms of how we can make that happen, I mean, a lot of us know already of the prayer from St. Alphonsus Liguori. It's a prayer that maybe opens us up to kind of help us express that we want Jesus, that we desire communion with Jesus. But it doesn't have to be that prayer alone. It can simply be a prayer that we make our own, one that says, Lord, in this trying time when I'm not able to go to church as I want to, um, I can open myself up still to you, and you can enter. And I'm recognizing that in faith. So it could be our own prayer. It doesn't have to be the prayer of St. Alphonsus Liguori or Pope Francis or anything like that. But those could be good vehicles to help us think of how to communicate or express that desire in a meaningful way.
So yeah, so if I'm praying with my wife at the end of the day, and both of
If,
us, yeah, if we're very lucky to get that in, and we're
and
able
if,
we're able to have spiritual communion together, right? And we could use our own words and pray that we would be able to have those graces. And you're talking about that desire is what really is important.
it's the desire, I think, and it's the desire in relation to what you would normally experience here at Mass when in more ordinary times we're able to come and gather as a community and recognize that the Lord is giving himself to us so that we can be an image of the Lord for other people. I think that's an important aspect, is that desire. And it's not just like, well, it's 7 o'clock or it's 8 o'clock, I got to get my hourly kind of spiritual communion. it the act itself is opening us up so that we can be ever more aware of God's presence in our lives. That's really what the Eucharist is trying to do as well when we receive it sacramentally.
This might be a weird question, and I was definitely speaking of the context of Mass, but could one receive spiritual communion outside of the context of Mass online?
Sure. So we have many people, for instance, now in the hospital who don't have access to Mass, or nursing homes where um, we're not always able to go for Mass, especially in times like these. And so someone who was a participant in the Eucharist for most of his or her life might be finding themselves isolated and without a priest. And certainly many of the people in regions across the world. The Amazon Synod was all about um, bringing, the sacramental life of the church to some people who are otherwise isolated from it. And those people, whether in nursing homes or the rainforest or wherever they are, who are isolated through no fault of their own, can certainly make that desire known that if uh, if they had the opportunity, they would certainly welcome sacramental communion, and they're putting themselves within the power of God, opening themselves up to that. So
I love that. I'm no St. Alphonsus Liguori expert, but I'm assuming that he wasn't alive within the last 100 years and maybe wrote that spiritual communion prayer without access to the internet.
I think you might be correct.
Just gonna guess. Last 100 years, just gonna guess. One of the concerns that I think a lot of people all over the country, maybe all over the world, are having right now during this quarantine time is a worry or a fear that parishioners and people might think that the new normal of participating in Mass is watching online. Maybe they might be able to might start thinking that I might be busy this weekend, and so I have spiritual communion. I can always skip Mass this weekend once things get back to normal because we have a really busy weekend, and I'll just make an act of spiritual communion instead. What would you say about that?
I would say that misses the point of spiritual communion and of Mass itself, because Mass is not just about receiving the Eucharist. Mass is a process. It's not a point, but a process where we hear first of God's mercy and God's love throughout salvation history, and that brings us to recognize Him in the breaking of the bread, a lot like the Emmaus reading we had this past weekend. And then, of course, it's not just in the receiving of the bread that we're done, but we have to go in peace, glorifying the Lord by our lives. So it's wrapping us up into this dynamic of putting ourselves in the power of God. Now, can you just say, well, we have a busy sports schedule this weekend, a year from now when hopefully the pandemic is over. We have a busy weekend, so let's just make spiritual communion. Well, no, I don't think so, because you're missing the point of coming together when it's possible to renew the covenant, basically, and to hear again what the covenant has done for you, this new and everlasting covenant. And because we are people, we are not just spiritual beings, we're not just material beings. We want those things together in ordinary circumstances. So we want the material reality of being next to, with, and singing with, and praying with other believing people. And, in times like this, when we can't physically congregate, we can be renewed spiritually. But in ordinary circumstances, as we know from the incarnation, material and spiritual belong together. They belong together.
Yeah, I love that because I've been trying to make that a huge part of my prayer lately. Right away, when I wasn't able to go to Mass for a few weeks in the beginning of this, I was like, I miss receiving communion. I miss the Eucharist. I miss being able to do that with my family. And then I had that kind of reminder, like, whoa, it's not just about that. We do need to come together in community, like you're saying. And so I've been trying to pray more lately to miss community, and it's been very easy to do that because now I miss praying with all the parishioners, and I'm very excited for the day when that comes, when we can join together again to worship.
Yeah, as good Catholics, we don't want to separate those things. We can't emphasize one to the disadvantage of the other. They belong together, really, and they're different dimensions of our life as church, which, by the way, the Second Vatican Council called a sacrament, or like a sacrament, that shows that we are meant for each other forever. So, I mean, we're going to go into eternity, in a sense, together in our risen body. So we want to celebrate that here and now, and not just wait for that. We want to be people of the living word and that living reality.
Absolutely. Well, I certainly appreciate this conversation on spiritual communion, and I'm excited to continue the series. We'll let people know what's coming down the pike, what's up next. But I'm excited and thankful for your wisdom here on our first episode of Coffee with Father Ryan. Is there any final words that you'd like to share?
This is not spiritual coffee. It's very good coffee. So thank you, Jonathan.
Oh, okay. Next time we'll address is spiritual coffee a thing? Because that would be great if I'm nowhere near it and need it. All
Yeah.
right. Until next time.
Thanks, John.